The Unitarian Universalist Church is easily the most liberal religion in America today. You can pretty much believe whatever you want as long as you affirm very social liberal policies. And it includes various atheists, neo-pagans, and Buddhists, and very heretical Christians all together under the same roof in the very heretical Unitarian Universalist Church. And if you've watched this channel for any amount of time, you would have known that I've made 2 videos about Operation Reconquista, which is the movement to make liberal churches, liberal Christian mainline churches, more conservative again. And this originally kind of started as a joke in my head. Hey, wouldn't it be kind of funny if I did some kind of post about hey, maybe we should make a Unitarian Universalist Reconquista. I thought that'd be kind of funny. But I don't know, just something began to brew in my head. And a while back, I looked up some stuff at the Unitarian Universalist Church, and I saw a church that was called First Universalist Church. I believe it was in Minneapolis. And it just really set me off because the Unitarian Universalist Church was not always what it is today. It was originally 2 very, very different religious traditions. One, the Unitarian Church, which is started out of the Congregationalist tradition, which is the same thing as the Pilgrims. They were founded off the idea of denying the deity of Jesus, so they taught Jesus is not God. They denied the Trinity, and that was the foundation of their church. And pretty much they just went on a liberalization path until they became completely anti-Christian. It's so weird looking back. Like, my grandfather actually has like a Unitarian newspaper from like the 1840s, and it's so weird how Unitarians were once to consider themselves Christians and actually were very hardcore about that too. So weird. But the Unitarian Church was actually once very influential, and I'm not a Unitarian. I'm a Trinitarian. I affirm the deity of Jesus. I believe in the Trinity. But the Unitarian Church was once very influential. I think it was a mainline church in America because we had several Unitarian presidents. Harvard Seminary, a big Ivy League school, was controlled by Unitarians for many years. And you could find a Unitarian church in most major cities in America. And a lot of people knew what Unitarians were. They were pretty influential in major American religious tradition. The other one, and getting back to my point about First Universalist Church in Minneapolis, was the Universalist Church in America. It was founded off the idea, and this is what I am, that all people will be saved through Christ Jesus, eventually. All people will eventually make it to heaven through Christ, through his cross. And this was the foundation of the Universalist Church. And, of course, we were kicked out of most major churches, so we formed our own club for ourselves, and it was the Universalist Church, formed back in the 18th century. And this church did very well for a long time. Looking back at the Second Great Awakening particularly, like the Universalist Church had a lot of impact. A lot of people were reading Universalist books. A lot of people were reading Universalist newspapers. And there were a lot of Universalist churches starting to form and pop up. They were never as influential as the Unitarians. Like, we never had a Universalist president, for instance. Well, there actually is some debate if Abraham Lincoln were a Universalist, but he was not a part of the Universalist Church. But the Universalist Church was still very influential. But the Unitarian Universalist Church was formed because both of these traditions peaked around the 1860s and then went into progressive decline. The Unitarian churches kicked the liberalism, the hyperdrive. Like, they just essentially denied everything Christian eventually and just became humanist. The Universalist Church had Unitarians within it, people who denied the deity of Jesus, and they continued to fall into heresy and apostasy. I'm not going to rewrite history and say the Universalist Church was perfect, but it was like a lot of mainline churches are today. It was sick and dying, but it was not dead. But what happened in 1961 is, I think, something horrible. The 2 churches merged for resources. It was simple as that. They did not really fit together as traditions. In fact, Unitarians mostly looked down upon Universalism as a more primitive version of Unitarianism, which it was not. It was a very different religious tradition based out of very different things, and they just merged together. Unitarians who were broadly post-Christian at that point, whether it be in the Universalist Church Unitarians and the Unitarians in the Unitarian Church, were very post-Christian and had just become humanists and pluralists at that point. And they just scrubbed the denomination clean of Christianity. Even to this day, the Unitarian Church is very ashamed of its Christian roots. In fact, the overwhelming majority of Unitarians do not identify as Christian. And the church is very clearly ashamed of its Christian roots. And it was only worsened because when the merger happened back in 1961, a lot of Universalists actually broke off because Universalists were still a lot more conservative. There were still a lot of Universalists who believed in the deity of Jesus, who were still Christian and wanted to remain Christian. And even today, we're going to get to them, there are still a few Universalist churches that are Christian left in that denomination. We're going to get to that. But and that's pretty much what happened. And that's what set me off about this First Universalist Church in Minneapolis, is That church, long time ago, was founded by people like me because it said it was a 150-year-old church. I believe it's in Minneapolis, but that doesn't really matter to the story. It was founded by people like me, for people like us because we were persecuted back then and called heretics, and we still are today. And so we created our own church, and that meant that church was once preaching biblical Christian universalism. But here we are 150 years later, the Unitarian takeover happens, and that church is now a very deeply heretical Unitarian Universalist church, which denies the essentials of Christianity and is actively ashamed of its Christian roots. And that just kind of set off something in me because the fundamental point of Operation Reconquista is this, and I think it's a very sensible point. Like, it makes a lot of sense. Is that essentially by running away from denominations, you're allowing your enemies to take the resources that your ancestors built up over the course of hundreds of years. You're allowing them to take the churches, you're allowing them to take the seminaries, you're allowing them to take the cultural influence and use it towards their goals and also some of the goals of the enemy. Because that's where ultimately a lot of this Unitarian Universalist ideas are coming from, is the enemy. Satan, and allowing them to work towards his goals. And for better or for worse, the Unitarian Universalist Church is all that we have left of our Universalist forefathers. It's all that we have left from them. And I really hate that because I hate to think that what I believe is the true faith, Christian Universalism, that a lot of the remnants of the Universalist Church are in the hands of complete heretics that just completely deny Christianity altogether. And Universalism did not start in the 18th century. It goes back to the time of Jesus Christ. There are many Universalists in the early church, and it did not just exist in the Universalist church. For instance, there has been a steady stream of Universalists in the Orthodox faith, along with other traditions like Anglicans, Lutherans, Methodists. But actually, the Universalist church was founded by a lot of former Methodists and Baptists. A lot of Universalist churches were formerly Baptist churches and then converted in. In fact, there was actually a break-off denomination that's really one of the only things left of the Universalist Church. It's called the Primitive Baptist Universalist Church. It exists mostly in the Appalachian Mountains, and it's pretty much all that's left. And it exists there. It's called the Primitive Baptist Universalist Church. I thought it was really interesting. It was a break-off. But yeah, so because kind of the thought came to me, it's like we've essentially have allowed what our ancestors made to fall into the hands of complete heretics. And it's like, is there any way to undo it? And that kind of just, again, something brewing in me. Like, is a Unitarian Universalist Reconquista possible? Or is it just some crazy far-out idea? And this is kind of my opinion on it. Is it possible? Is what we're going to talk about. And then I'm going to talk about, is there a better idea? First, is it possible? Well, believe it or not, there is actually a very, very small remnant of Unitarian Universalist churches that are still Christian churches. They're called the Council of Christian Unitarian Universalist Churches. There's about 26 member churches. And put that in comparison, there are about 1,100 Unitarian Universalist congregations, a little bit less in America. So they're very small, only a percent or two of the Unitarian Universalist Church, but they still do exist. Weirdly enough, they're mostly in New England. Like, there's like 12 in Massachusetts, which blows my mind, and then like several others in a variety of other states in New England, which is so weird because New England is by far the most post-Christian part of America, which is so interesting to me. But these churches are still around. Most of them are actually Universalist churches. For instance, First Universalist Church in Providence, Rhode Island, is a great example of an historic Universalist church that's still around today. There's a Memorial Universalist Church in D.C., and there are a few other of these Christian Universalist churches left, and a few of them are also historically Unitarian churches. But you can believe Jesus is God in these churches too. There are people in them that do believe that. For instance, King's Chapel in Boston is actually one of the oldest churches in America. It's an historically Unitarian church. It used to be Anglican, but it converted to Unitarian. But it's still Christian. And by that, I would mean they still practice a Christian worship and still baptize and stuff. And these are really a few churches that are left. There's also the UU Christian Fellowship, which I counted. A lot of them include a lot of the same churches I talked about, but not all of them are. And so the Christian Council of Unitarian Universalist Churches, but I counted there's about 60 of them that have chapters. And then there's also the Christian Universalist Association, which is the most recent thing. And it was mostly founded out of the Unitarian Universalist Church of Christian Universalists trying to form a new community. And it's still mostly in that denomination, though it has become a poly-denominational thing. And those are really your institutions for Christianity in the Unitarian Universalist Church. So it's not completely far gone. So is a Unitarian Universalist Reconquista possible? Well, really, kind of the foundation of Operation Reconquista is that the mainline churches have declining membership. But the Unitarian Universalist Church in recent years has actually seen a boost in membership. It's mostly just because of liberal atheists essentially finding a club. The Unitarian Universalist Church caters to a demographic of people who don't really like the beliefs of organized religion. They don't like having organized beliefs, having to agree with people on common beliefs, except for social justice issues. They do like that. But like the community that organized religion gives you. So a lot of people are joining the Unitarian Universalist Church for that, especially in the South. The Unitarian Universalist Church is actually growing a lot, I've heard. So that's the first problem for the idea of a Unitarian Universal Reconquista. But a lot of Unitarian Universalists are old. Or at least middle age. For instance, the average age of a Unitarian Universalist is 53, according to the 2020 religious census. And if you go to an average Unitarian Universalist church, you're going to find a lot of old people, a lot of gray-haired people that are going to be dead in the next 20 years. I think pretty much every church in America is going to suffer from the boomer bust, I call it, which essentially is that the baby boomers, when they die off, they're just going to leave a massive hole in most of major American churches and membership, just because there were just so many of them. And unfortunately, there's just not a lot of young people to replace them. And this is true of most churches in America. So they're going to suffer from the boomer bust. And the Unitarian Universalist Church will suffer from that too. I also do think the age of social liberalism is coming to an end. I do talk a bit more about that in my video, The End of the Modern World. But I do believe that we're in the end of our age of history. And I do believe that social liberalism and just the liberalism that kind of dominates in our age is suffering and going to come to an end. But a lot of people, I do think, are just going to get tired of politics, is what I mean. Really, my generation, Generation Z, has searched for meaning in politics, and I just don't think that's going to work. And I do think that's going to come back to bite the Unitarian Universalist Church eventually. I was reading an interesting paper about that, making the same argument by Unitarian Universalists, that the Unitarian Universalist has essentially just churches essentially just replaced a religious core with a political core, and this will eventually come back to bite them in the long run, because politics just isn't as fulfilling as religion. But getting back to my point, is a Unitarian Universalist Reconquista possible? Well, I just made the point that I do think that Unitarian Universalist membership, though it is growing some now because of an influx of liberal atheists, a lot of churches are losing membership, a lot of individual congregations, and a lot of congregations it's only going to get worse because they're going to see a bust in membership. I would say for Unitarian Universalist Reconquista, the goal would be to convert Unitarian Universalist churches to Christian Universalism and to gain voting power in the denomination. The church is Congregationalist, meaning every congregation has independence. So that's how there are still Christian Unitarian Universalist churches, because they have independence of belief and worship and all these different things. So really, it's just by congregation basis. I'd say your first priority would be strengthening the few remaining Christian churches left in the denomination. They're mostly in New England, but there are some in the South, and there's only one in the West, in Turley, Oklahoma. So if you live in the West, I'm sorry, you're kind of screwed here. But especially if you live in the Northeast, especially New England, especially Massachusetts, there are still a lot of these churches left. They're still very liberal Christian. Like, a lot of them are pretty much indistinguishable from a United Church of Christ. In fact, some of them are so indistinguishable that they're actually duly affiliated with the United Church of Christ. The United Church of Christ is essentially the Trinitarian Congregationalist. They did not become Unitarians, and they ended up becoming the very liberal but still Christian denomination, the United Church of Christ, which is pretty liberal. One of the most probably the most liberal still Christian denomination in America today, at least mainstream. So that's just interesting. But those churches should be your first priority, strengthening those if you happen to live near one, and just look up the Council of Christian Unitarian Universalist Churches to see that would definitely be the first priority, strengthening those churches, giving them more of a voting power in it. Then it would be going to churches that have a UU Christian fellowship, because they do have some Christian presence. Just going to churches that do have a large number of people who identify as Christians. But even then, the Unitarian Universal Church, a lot of these Christians deny the deity of Jesus. Then I would say probably your next place to go, in fact, I think maybe even better than some of those with UU Christian fellowships, would be churches that are dying. Because I talked about some of these churches are dying. They just have a bunch of old people, and they're going to die off. Some of these churches you couldn't really save. Like, I don't think a complete Unitarian Universalist Reconquista is possible, just because some UU churches are completely disinterested in actual spirituality and are just politics clubs. Those churches you really cannot save. I'm speaking a bit hypocritically there, because I could not be a part of a UU Reconquista. because the only Unitarian churches near me, and there's very few, and they're all far away, are just politics clubs. They're just very, very, very political, no religiosity at all. But if you can find a church that is interested in some sort of spirituality, and you do have some friends that are Christian Universalists, which is possible, you could implant yourselves into the congregation and greatly influence it, because a few people can have a lot of influence, especially in a dying church. And you could influence it and make it more Christian. You could establish some sort of Christian fellowship, a Bible study or something in there, and then gradually influence it. Perhaps opening up a Christian worship service, like a lot of Unitarian churches actually have different worship services to cater to their different members. Like some will have a humanist service and then a more traditional religious service to cater to different crowds. So it's not so crazy if you were able to get a sizable number of Christians into your local church to start back a more Christian worship. And then as the older people die off and you would have children, in theory, you could take that UU church, elect a more minister that's more in line with your beliefs, perhaps hiring them off of a denomination of the United Church of Christ, which is totally possible, and greatly influence it, because a lot of, once again, there is like this weird connection point between the United Church of Christ and the Unitarian Universalist Church. And I'm going to get more into that a bit later in this video. You could, in theory, take back the congregation, and then if you were to technically organize that, this is all very theoretical, and I'm getting ready to get into if I think it's even a good idea, but in theory, if you really were diehard about it, because, I mean, God is on our side, if you were really hardcore about this kind of thing, and you were able to find a congregation that does have some religious interest and is on the smaller side and dying off, you and some of your friends could go into the congregation and influence it. And this is really the biggest problem for liberal religion today, and I wouldn't consider myself a religious liberal. I'm a Universalist. They're very different. Universalism is rooted in the Christian tradition. But this problem for liberal religion today is that liberal Christianity is actually very popular. A lot of people believe in it. The problem is that they have a mainline liberal view of the Bible, which is that the Bible is infallible. But they have a evangelical view of the church, which means they don't really think the church is important. So a lot of them are either forming non-denominational churches and they're just starting from scratch, essentially, or more likely they're just doing their own thing, them and their Bibles all alone. And this is a massive problem for liberal Christianity, because there are a bunch of liberal Christians, but they're not organizing together and influencing existing churches. And I think this is really horrible for liberal Christianity, because essentially they're shooting themselves in the foot. So yeah, it is totally possible if this were an actual movement. It's possible if enough people want to, even just a few hundred people, if they really wanted to, they could go scout at Unitarian Universalist churches and start implanting congregations. Like, it's totally possible. Like, if they really wanted to, it's possible. And because eventually they would start getting some voting power in the UU. I would say that probably the best goal would not be a complete reconquista of the Unitarian Universalist Church, but rather taking a fragment of the Unitarian Universalist Church and using that to help reestablish a new Christian Universalist denomination. And I do think that's a more realistic goal, is to help establish Christian Universalist chapters that teach a more biblical Christian Universalism, Trinitarian Christian Universalism, and to start establishing them in local Unitarian Universalist congregations, especially ones that used to be Universalist churches, because it's dishonoring to our ancestors to just let those churches be taken over by Unitarians who have no respect for the Christianity that those people built those churches with. So those would be your first and foremost goals, to be formerly Universalist churches, because you'd be taking them back for Christian Universalism. Like, if people really wanted to, like, this is just purely theoretical. I don't think it will happen, to be honest. But if we really wanted to, us Christian Universalists, we could organize together. And the Christian Universalist Association is a good example of this kind of already happening. We could, in theory, organize together and implant Christian Universalists into dying Unitarian Universalist congregations, influence them to start having more Christian services and to begin to become more explicitly Christian, and then fully take the congregation for ourselves and make it a Christian church again. In theory, that's possible. Like, it really is possible. So finally, now I've shown what's possible. Then the final goal would be, after enough churches, especially probably New England. New England is the most realistic region because it still has a bunch of Christian Unitarian Universalist churches left in it. But Then after a few years, maybe 10, 20 years, especially once the boomer bust happens, when all these boomers are dead, a strong Christian Universalist coalition to either to take greater control of the Unitarian Universalist Church and make it more explicitly Christian again, maybe make it more like the United Church of Canada, which is a very, very liberal church that is open to various religious and faith traditions, but is still explicitly Christian. Maybe you could turn the Unitarian Universalist Church into that, bring it back to its Christian roots, but still being very liberal. Or I think more realistically, there actually is talk of a Unitarian Universalist schism, believe it or not. Pretty much what Unitarian Universalism has become in practice is just about not having a creed. And there's a big talk of the schism in the denomination right now because a lot of Unitarians are upset that the church is trying to force being woke essentially down their throats. They don't want to be forced into affirming political liberalism because that's against their creed. You can't force somebody to affirm that because they're a non-creedal faith, and that's actually brewing up a schism in the Unitarian Universalist Church. That and issues of government because there's fears that they're infringing upon congregational freedom as well. So there really were a schism in the Unitarian Universalist Church, and definitely that more conservative Unitarian Universalist, so weird, conservative Unitarian Universalist, would definitely be the ideal church to influence towards Christian Universalists. But I do think that the ultimate goal would be, we totally could, if we really wanted to, influence some congregations and probably eventually form some sort of Christian Universalist coalition within the denomination, perhaps even breaking off if we've taken back enough churches, and merging with some other Christian Universalist churches to form a second Christian Universalist denomination, but now being more historically rooted to the Christian Universalist tradition by holding many of the churches our ancestors built. Finally, is this a good idea? Is it even worth it? Well, for one, it's mostly the Unitarian church that's left. The Unitarians vastly outnumbered the Universalists, so most of the churches in the Unitarian Universalist Church were founded as Unitarian churches, not as Universalist churches. So you wouldn't be really reconquisting. You'd be more like stealing them from the Unitarians. Second of all, the Universalists were broke. I mean, the Unitarians did have a lot of influence and did have money, but the Universalists really were not that rich or powerful. And some of their churches were definitely very beautiful and had some influence, but they just never were an insanely influential denomination. Like Operation Reconquista for a lot of these other churches makes a lot of sense because a lot of these churches have generations of wealth and money and have thousands of congregations all across the country. It makes a lot of sense for a Reconquista in those churches, but even then, the Unitarian Universalist Church is not that big. It only has 150,000 members, which is even smaller than the smallest of the mainline churches, the Disciples of Christ. And it's just a lot smaller, and especially the historically Universalist church that were once Universalists are even way smaller. There just is not a whole lot of them. So is that even worth it to Reconquista to do all this effort in such an insanely liberal denomination? Because a Christian Universalist Reconquista, we get a lot of pushback in the Unitarian Church because the Unitarian Church nowadays is all about being open and affirming everyone's beliefs, unless, of course, they're not socially liberal, which is a source of a schism in that denomination. And it just doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to go for all the effort for what really isn't a lot of resources. So is there a better plan? And I do think, though, that some of the churches are worth it. Like, I do think that trying to save the remaining few Christian Unitarian Universalist churches is actually worth our time because those churches are still Christian. I always heard God preserves a remnant, and I guess even in the Unitarian Universalist Church, he has preserved a remnant. I do think those churches are worth your time. If you happen to live near one, just look up the Council of Christian Unitarian Universalist Churches and see if you live near one, especially live in New England. I do think those churches are actually worth some kind of Reconquista. But for the whole Unitarian Universalist Church, I think there are better alternatives. But in theory, it's totally possible, especially formerly Christian Universalist churches. I do think it would be worth at least trying to, because just trying to retake what our ancestors built, it does just really annoy me, the thought that the enemy now has churches that were built by people like me in a time of great persecution of our faith. And we're still greatly persecuted today. The mainstream Christian world still thinks we're just unapologetically horrible heretics that are just going to burn in hell. So it really does annoy me to know that a lot of the churches we built are right now in the hands of heretics. And this is because the Universalist Church in America suffered from just having all these people of all these different backgrounds. They had a lot of Baptists, they had Methodists, and all these different people that merged together, Anglicans, all these people that merged together from all these different backgrounds. And they just all kind of merged into this one big denomination, and they were always having the jungling beliefs. In fact, another example of the Unitarian Universalist Church is really just the Unitarian Church, and really is not taking much from its Christian Universalist roots, is this non-creedalism, because the Universalist Church actually did have a creed. It was called the Winchester Profession, and it affirmed basic beliefs like the belief in a Christian God, a belief in the Bible, a belief in Christian Universalism, of course, a belief in those things. And it's called the Winchester Profession of 1803. It's really cool. You should look it up. And this was the foundation. This was very important to the Universalist Church. It was their uniting creed. And this is just another sign that the Unitarian Universalist Church has no real basis in the Universalist tradition, is that it does not embrace the creed, the Winchester Profession. So, is it worth it? And what alternatives is there? I do think that we Universalists should be doing one thing, and that is instead of forming new churches, we should not be sitting around just being alone, not going to church at all. That's a terrible idea. Second, instead of forming new churches, unless we absolutely have to, we should instead be trying to influence older existing churches. The best churches are mainline Protestant churches, which are those liberal denominations. Not all of them are liberal, especially if you live in the South of the Midwest. A lot of them are moderate. And by moderate, I would mean not affirming gay marriage. That's what I would mean by moderate. A lot of these churches are dying and are not very dogmatic on hell. For instance, you would not hear a sermon believing in the eternal damnation at any of these churches. So you could really influence this congregation. I do think that you could really have a lot of influence. These churches are a lot more worth it. For me, the biggest problem with a Unitarian Universalist Reconquista would be your very soul, because Unitarian Universalist churches, because they do not have a Christian liturgy, they don't have Christian worship, they don't have the sacraments, are spiritually deprived. And I'd be worried for your soul, because you wouldn't be having that. Now, if you were really, really hardcore and you had some friends, you could take back a Unitarian Universalist church if you really wanted to, especially if it's a dying church. You really could, but I just think because there's just not a Christian worship there, as much as I hate to admit it, because I really hate that churches our ancestors built have fallen into the hands of heretics, I don't think it's worth it. Excluding those inside the Christian Council of Unitarian Universalist churches, because they still have Christian liturgy, Christian worship, a Christian mass. Maybe I really do think it's up to your judgment. If like this idea really interests you, I guess go to your local Unitarian Universalist church and judge for yourself if it's worth a Reconquista. But it probably isn't, though I would pray it would be. And just, I think even if we could save some, for instance, even a lot of those Unitarian Universalist churches have Christian fellowships in them. They're very hyper liberal from what I've seen, and definitely would not be accepting of making Universalism the major religion. I mean, I do think it's possible. If we really wanted to, we could take churches that we made Christian Universalists by influencing them and put them into the Unitarian Universalist coalition and give them voting power. That's possible, sure. If we really, really, really wanted to, I guess we could at least retake a substantial portion of the Unitarian Universalist coalition, which would really just be what is rightfully the Universalist portion of it, because the Unitarians outnumber the Universalists. So we could get a sizable fraction. We would be getting back the Universalist Church in America, essentially. We could get a sizable fraction of those 1,100 UU congregations. If we could, say, get 200, 300, 400, we would be getting a pretty equivalent to what the Universalist Church had, because the Universalist Church was very small. It lost a bunch of membership from the time of the Civil War on. It was never big to begin with, but it did have a lot of influence. You do have to remember that also America had a lot lower population back then, so a church that small could have a lot more influence. But yeah, that's kind of, I guess, really is the point. Like, if we could retake a substantial portion of the Unitarian Church, we'd be getting back the Universalist portion, I suppose. I think I've heard that the Universalist Church had about 25,000 members from the time of the merger. So if you could get about 25,000 members worth, you would be getting the Unitarian Universalist Church back. A second Universalist Church, what are my thoughts on that? I've been meaning to talk about that for a while. I think that just there's other major issues. I do believe Universalism is compatible with every Christian tradition, but Christians are always going to see certain things differently. Like sacraments, worship styles, different beliefs about minor issues of the faith. We're always going to see those kind of things differently. Take like a baptismal generation or entire sanctification, just to throw out some theological terms. Those are always going to be debated issues. And I do think that we should be trying to influence, especially the mainline churches in every tradition, to have a Christian Universalist equivalent, because there's always going to be theological disagreements about certain issues. And that's really kind of what I got to say. I do want to remind you that if you are a Christian Universalist, I'd recommend joining a church. It's good for your spiritual health to have the word being read to you and to be receiving the sacraments. A moderate mainline or a liberal mainline is probably your best place, especially a smaller one with a bunch of old people. I'm personally doing that. I'm going to be joining a mainline church soon. I'm still kind of in the middle of church hopping, but I'll be joining a moderate or liberal mainline, and I will be influencing them there of my Christian Universalist beliefs, which I'm very open about, and doing my best to spread the good news there. But one thing I do want to end the video on is I was told as a little boy that I could be a missionary everywhere. I even sung the little song, I can be a missionary anywhere. Don't got to go to Africa to go be a missionary. Okay, I can't really remember the words, to be honest. But, pretty much the point of the song was you don't have to go like Africa or Asia or South America or to lead the country or to do all this stuff to be a missionary. You can be a missionary anywhere, anytime, any place, in your own personal life. And everywhere is a mission field, and that includes the Unitarian Universalist Church. We got to face it that a lot of these people are going to hell. And if you visit a local Unitarian Universalist church and you believe that you could do good there for the goodness of God and His truth and His kingdom, then you go right ahead if you believe that, and try to influence that place for Christ, because everywhere is a mission field, including the Unitarian Universalist Church. I personally think it's worth more of my time to influence a local liberal mainline Protestant denomination, congregation, for the truth of Christian Universalism, because liberal Christianity is really kind of struggling with an identity crisis. It knows what it's not. It knows it's not evangelical Protestants. They know they're not Catholics, but they don't really know what they are, and they don't know really what distinguishes them from the world. And I think influencing them with biblical universalism would be a really good thing, because biblical universalism and mainstream Christianity are so different, because we believe in a God of love who will not torture us forever and ever. And most Christians fear God. I mean, John says perfect love casteth out all fear. But a lot of Christians are honestly afraid of hell and torment. Of course, I do think hell is a real place and it's terrible. And that's another reason, back to my point, you can be a missionary anywhere. A lot of Unitarian Universalists are going to hell. So we do need to be influencing them for the truth. So if you believe that you can do good for Christ and His kingdom at a Unitarian Universalist church, then you go ahead and try your best. Just be careful not to fall into the pitfalls of the world. But I know this is a crazy idea. I didn't take it to be too serious, like the idea of a Unitarian Universalist Reconquista. I mean, it would be awesome if we could take back a sizable portion of the Universalist Church, and make it Christian again. That would be awesome, and reestablish a Christian Universalist denomination. I do think that we Christian Universalists should be trying to influence local churches, and I'm not sure about a new Universalist denomination, but at the same time, I wouldn't mind it at the same time, I would actually really like a new Universalist denomination. I do think, though, that we should be focusing more on building churches, building up more, like rebuilding traditional existing churches, influencing them for the good truth of Christian Universalism, and having more of an impact on our local community, spreading this truth. And I do think we should be more evangelistic. I don't see why I can't do gospel tracts or billboards and things like fundamentalists do. And I could go on. Perhaps in another video, I'll make my opinions on the Christian Universalist Association, because I think it's doing a lot of good, but I also think it's doing a lot of bad, because it's still very liberal and Unitarian. They don't dogmatize belief in the Trinity, which I think is very problematic. I've gone on long enough. This wasn't so much a serious thing. I don't know. I mean, if this really inspires you and makes you want to go convert some Unitarian Universalists, you go right ahead. I'm glad. But this was more of a thought exercise to kind of think about, what can I be doing if you are a Christian Universalist listening, which I would assume you would be, because, I mean, why else would you be watching this? I mean, if you aren't, that's cool. I mean, just look up Total Victory of Christ, the Love and Relenting channel, Sovereign Love. All these are great channels, and many more. There's many other great channels and books and all these different things about Christian Universalism. My favorite is Robin Perry. If you're not a Christian Universalist listening and you've made it this far, it means you probably have some interest in the subject. So I'd recommend looking up the things I've just recommended. And of course, watch this channel. I talk a lot about the subject. But this was really a thought experiment on what can we Christian Universalists be doing to influence our churches and our communities to Christ and the true news of His ultimate love and radical love for all people. It would be awesome to see a new Universalist denomination This time around, I hope we be dogmatically Trinitarian, keep us from falling into heresy. I do think we need to do some things differently this time, but it would be so cool if we could make a new denomination, and it would be awesome if we could take parts of the existing Unitarian Universalist Church and make them Christian again and put them into that denomination. I don't know. It's just very interesting to think about. Some food for thought. This whole video is just meant to be some food for thought. Don't take anything I've said too seriously about reconquisting the Unitarian Universalist Church, but if it inspires you, then I'm glad. Just like and subscribe. I hope you enjoyed the video. Y'all have a good day. God bless, and may Christ conquer.